Rain lashed against the carriage glass, smelling of soot, crushed wet leaves, and the sour tang of London streets. Beatrice stared at the cipher in her lap, the damp parchment curling at its edges. 30 men of the crown had bled over this puzzle. It took her exactly 4 miles of bruised ribs, a cracked axle, and the rhythmic jarring sway of the coach to realize the answer was staggeringly, insultingly simple. She folded the paper. Now, she just had to survive telling him. The leather seat of the hired hackney was split down the middle, exposing coarse horsehair that scratched at the wool of Beatrice's skirt. She didn't adjust her posture. The discomfort was a necessary anchor, something sharp and real to keep her mind from spinning out into the cold damp of the November afternoon. Her fingers were stained with ink. A dark, indelible blue smeared across the pad of her right index finger, a consequence of frantically copying the harbormaster's ledger before the magistrate's men could seize it. She rubbed her thumb over the stain. It felt tacky. The carriage hit a rut, throwing her shoulder against the wooden paneling. A dull throb radiated down her collarbone. Beatrice exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath that bloomed into a white cloud in the freezing cab. On her lap, the copied ledger sat beside the intercepted French cipher. For 3 weeks, the finest minds in the Admiralty had treated the cipher like a complex algebraic equation. They had looked for numerical substitutions, Caesar shifts, polyalphabetic keys. They had looked for genius. Beatrice looked out the window at the muddy, churning Thames in the distance. The smell of wet wool from her own damp cloak was beginning to nauseate her. She looked back down at the numbers. The 14th of February, 2022. She wasn't a mathematician. She was a woman who had spent the last 5 years managing the crumbling finances of a ruined family estate by the sea. She knew the cost of flour, the price of smuggled brandy, and she knew the ocean. She traced the numbers with her ink-stained finger. It wasn't a mathematical equation. It was a schedule. 14. The 14th day of the lunar cycle. The highest tide. 2. 2 hours past midnight. 8. The depth of the water at the cove's entrance. 22. The exact nautical coordinates of the sandbar where the drop-off ship would anchor. The missing Admiralty silver wasn't being moved through the bustling ports of Dover or the guarded roads of Kent. It was being dragged through the treacherous, jagged rocks of the eastern coast, timed perfectly with the spring tides. The smugglers didn't have a genius cryptographer. They had an almanac. Beatrice didn't feel a rush of triumphant adrenaline. She just felt tired. A deep bone-aching exhaustion settled behind her eyes, accompanied by the sharp prickle of a looming headache. She leaned her head back against the rotting velvet of the carriage wall. It was so stupid. Men built labyrinths to hide their secrets, assuming everyone else was looking for a maze, when all they really needed was a shovel to bury it in the dirt. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic splash of the horses' hooves in the muck. She had the answer. She held the salvation of the Duke of Westford's reputation, and by extension, the pardon for her falsely accused brother. But the knot in her stomach pulled tighter, heavy, and cold. Having the answer was only half the battle. Handing it to a man who despised her very existence without bruising his fragile, aristocratic ego was the real war. The carriage lurched to a violent halt. The iron gates of Westford Manor loomed through the freezing rain, indifferent and imposing. Beatrice gathered her papers, her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, she told herself, but from the draft leaking through the floorboards. She shoved the parchment into her leather satchel, ignoring how the damp had warped the buckle. It was time to play the fool. The heat inside the manor was an immediate physical assault. It smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and the heavy suffocating smoke of a coal fire. Beatrice stood in the grand foyer, water pooling around the muddy soles of her boots onto the immaculate black and white marble tiles. A footman, his nose slightly wrinkled, relieved her of her soaked cloak. Beneath it, her dark blue gown was entirely unremarkable, frayed slightly at the cuffs. She felt small, a sudden ugly flare of insecurity twisting in her chest. She hated herself for it. "The Duke is in his study, Miss Hastings," the butler intoned, his voice devoid of any inflection. "He instructed me to send you in upon arrival, though he is currently occupied with Lord Cavendish." Beatrice nodded, keeping her jaw clamped shut. She followed the butler down a corridor lined with oil paintings of dead men who all shared the same arrogant slope of the nose. The heavy oak doors to the study were partially open. The voices inside were loud, carrying the sharp, clipped tones of men accustomed to being agreed with. "It's a substitution cipher, Arthur, I'm telling you," a voice, Cavendish, was saying. "Look at the frequency of the eights. It corresponds to the letter E in standard French distributions." "And the 20s? The 45s? That was Arthur. The Duke. His voice was lower, a dark, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "There is no 45 in the alphabet, Richard." Beatrice stepped into the room. The study was dim, illuminated by a roaring fire and 2 oil lamps on a massive mahogany desk. 3 men stood clustered around it, leaning over a map of southern England and a scatter of papers. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Westford, stood at the center. He had his coat off, his waistcoat unbuttoned, the stark white of his shirt glowing in the firelight. He smelled heavily of expensive bergamot, stale cigar smoke, and the faint copper tang of scotch. He looked up as she entered. His eyes, a pale, startling gray, locked onto hers. There was no greeting in them, only a flicker of mild, exhausted irritation. "Miss Hastings," he said, not straightening up. "You're late." "The roads, Your Grace. The mud was halfway to the axle." Her own voice sounded thin, reedy in the cavernous room. She hated it. She stepped forward, her hand moving instinctively toward the satchel at her hip. "I've been reviewing the copies of the ledger you sent. I believe I have—" "Not now, Beatrice," Arthur interrupted, his tone shifting into something distinctly patronizing. He didn't even look at her. His gaze had already dropped back to the map. "Cavendish is onto a mathematical progression. We don't have time for your brother's frantic theories." "It isn't my brother's theory," she said, her fingers tightening around the leather strap of her bag. "And it isn't a mathematical progression. It's—" Arthur sighed. It was a heavy, theatrical sound. He finally stood upright, turning to face her fully. He was a large man, his broad shoulders blocking the firelight, casting her entirely in his shadow. "Beatrice," he said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a soothing, infuriating cadence, the voice one might use on a spooked horse or a hysterical child. "I know you are worried about Thomas. I know the threat of the gallows makes people desperate to find patterns where there are none. But this is matters of state security. It requires a certain coldness of logic." He reached out, his large, warm hand patting her frozen shoulder in a gesture that made her want to flinch violently. She forced herself to remain perfectly still. "Go sit by the fire," he murmured, giving her a gentle push toward the armchairs. "Get warm. Let us handle this. Leave the thinking to the men." Beatrice froze. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, thick and elastic. She didn't deliver a biting retort. She didn't throw the solved cipher in his face. Her throat constricted. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted the sudden hot iron flavor of blood. She looked at him. She noticed with a detached sort of hyperfocus a tiny flaky crumb of what looked like a scone resting on the lapel of his waistcoat. It made him look utterly ridiculous. It made his grand patriarchal posturing look like a farce. A hysterical bubble of laughter pushed at the back of her throat. She swallowed it down, the effort making her eyes water slightly. To them, it probably looked like the beginning of feminine tears. Perfect. Let them think it. "Of course, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice perfectly level, deadened of all emotion. "Forgive my intrusion." She turned away from the desk, her damp skirts heavy around her ankles, and walked toward the fireplace. She sat in the wingback chair, the leather squeaking beneath her. She placed her satchel on her lap, folding her hands neatly over it. She tasted blood. She stared into the flames. "Let them rot," she thought. "Let them spin their wheels until the silver is in France and Arthur's reputation is ashes. But Thomas would hang. She closed her eyes. She couldn't let them fail, but she absolutely refused to hand them the victory. For 20 minutes, Beatrice sat in the suffocating heat of the fire, the crackle and pop of the burning log serving as a baseline to the men's increasingly frantic arguments. "If we shift the matrix by 3, Cavendish muttered, scratching furiously with a quill, the sound grating on Beatrice's frayed nerves. "No, damn it, that makes the second word XQZ. It's a cipher of names." The third man, a quiet, balding magistrate named Higgins, suggested weakly. "Perhaps French generals? They wouldn't be moving 3 tons of stolen silver using the names of dead Frenchmen," Arthur snapped. He paced the length of the carpet, his boots thudding heavily. The bergamot scent wafted past Beatrice every time he turned. She hated how physically imposing he was. She hated that, despite her intense resentment, her eyes tracked the line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. It was a stupid, involuntary biological response to an aesthetically pleasing, entirely useless man. Beatrice shifted in her chair. The heat had baked the dampness out of her wool skirt, leaving it smelling faintly of wet dog. She was thirsty. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. None of the men looked at her. She walked over to the side table where a silver tea service sat abandoned. She poured herself a cup of water from a crystal carafe, her back to the room. As she drank, she looked at the reflection of the men in the dark window pane. They looked desperate. Time was running out. If they didn't intercept the drop by tomorrow night, the silver was gone. Beatrice set the glass down. She unbuckled her satchel. She didn't pull out the solved cipher. Instead, she pulled out a secondary document she had brought, a standard, widely published almanac of coastal tides she had purchased for a penny at a train station 3 days ago. She had circled several dates and depths in the margins in her dark blue ink. She walked quietly back toward the desk. The men were huddled over the map of Kent, arguing about land routes. Beatrice stopped at the opposite end of the desk. She placed the open almanac down on the polished mahogany near the edge of their sprawling map. She didn't say a word. She just left it there, an innocuous, open book, and reached across to adjust the position of an unlit candelabra, pretending it was in her way. "Miss Hastings, please." Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples, not looking up. "Do not fuss with the furniture. It's distracting." "My apologies," she murmured smoothly. She withdrew her hand, leaving the almanac perfectly aligned with the edge of the cipher parchment Arthur was leaning over. She walked back to her chair and sat down. 10 minutes passed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, loud and rhythmic. Tick, tack, tick, tack. It sounded like a hammer against her skull. Arthur cursed under his breath, leaning heavily on his palms, staring at the cipher. 14, 2, 8, 22. It's not letters. It's not coordinates. It's too small to be coordinates. He sighed, standing up straight to stretch his back. As he did, his gaze dropped. He looked blindly at the desk, his eyes resting on the open pages of the almanac Beatrice had left. Beatrice stopped breathing. She watched him from beneath her eyelashes, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Arthur stared at the book, his brow furrowed. He looked at the cipher. He looked back at the book. Beatrice saw the exact moment the gears caught. His breath hitched, a tiny, barely perceptible catch in his chest. His posture changed, stiffening. He slowly reached out and dragged the almanac closer to the cipher. "Cavendish," Arthur said. His voice was suddenly very quiet. The bluster was gone. "Yes?" Cavendish looked up, ink smeared on his chin. "Look at this." Arthur pointed a long finger at the almanac. "The 14th, a spring tide." Cavendish frowned, leaning in. "What of it?" "The second hour past midnight," Arthur continued, his voice tight. "The water depth at—" "Good God! What?" Higgins scrambled forward. "It's not a cipher," Arthur breathed, the realization washing over him. He looked up, his pale eyes wide, staring at the wall opposite him. "It's a tide chart, a schedule. They're moving it by sea, through the eastern coves, where the water depth hits exactly 8 fathoms. By God! Cavendish whispered, dropping his quill. "Arthur, you're a genius." Beatrice pressed her lips together, her teeth sinking back into the torn flesh of her inner cheek. The copper taste flooded her mouth again. Arthur stood frozen. He looked at the almanac. He looked at the blue ink circling the numbers. He knew that handwriting. He had received enough desperate letters from her regarding her brother to know the sharp, slanted scrawl of her pen. Slowly, agonizingly, Arthur turned his head. He looked across the dim room, past the firelight, straight into the shadows where Beatrice sat. She didn't look away. She met his gaze perfectly, her face a mask of placid, polite emptiness. She raised her eyebrows slightly, tilting her head in a silent question, as if she hadn't a clue in the world what had just transpired. Arthur's jaw flexed. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly in the flickering light. He realized what he was looking at. He realized who had put it there. And he realized that if he admitted it now, in front of Cavendish and Higgins, he would have to admit that he had dismissed the very woman who had just outsmarted the entire British Admiralty in a bumpy carriage ride. Beatrice watched him struggle. She watched the arrogant Duke of Westford war with his own pride. The silence stretched, vibrating with a sudden electric tension between them. "Say it," she thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Admit it." Part 4. The silent checkmate. Arthur swallowed. The corded muscles of his neck worked visibly under the starched white collar of his shirt. He looked away from Beatrice, his gaze snapping back to the almanac, then to Cavendish, who was practically vibrating with the thrill of this discovery. "Yes," Arthur said. His voice was hoarse. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and grating in the quiet study. "Yes, Richard. It seems the simplest answer was the correct one." "Brilliant," Higgins muttered, wiping a sheen of nervous sweat from his balding forehead. "Utterly brilliant, Your Grace. We've been staring at the damn thing for 3 weeks. Quite." Arthur's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. He didn't look at the dark corner where Beatrice sat. He couldn't. Beatrice remained perfectly still. The leather of the chair squeaked faintly as she inhaled. There it was, the theft. It was a bloodless crime, executed in broad daylight, sanctioned by the unwritten rules of their society. A man of title could not be educated by a ruined spinster. It was a matter of natural order. She felt a brief, ugly flare of pure rage, hot and acidic in the back of her throat, but it burned out almost immediately, leaving behind a cold, settled ash. She hadn't come here for praise. She had come here for Thomas. If letting Arthur Pendleton wear the laurel wreath was the price of her brother's head, she would tie the ribbon on the damn thing herself. "We need to mobilize," Arthur commanded, the hesitation vanishing as the familiar mantle of authority settled back over his shoulders. He was in his element now: logistics, men, violence. "Higgins, send a rider to the barracks at Dover. I want 30 dragoons ready to ride within the hour. Cavendish, secure the warrants. If this drops at the second hour past midnight, we have barely 6 hours to reach the eastern coast and set an ambush." The eastern coast is a broad target, Arthur," Cavendish pointed out, tapping the map. "Even with the depth at 8 fathoms, there are half a dozen inlets that match." Beatrice stood up. The rustle of her skirts was loud. The 3 men turned to look at her, a collective expression of mild irritation crossing their faces, as if they had forgotten she was even in the room. "You will want Blackwood Cove," Beatrice said, her voice perfectly flat. Arthur frowned, the irritation deepening into a scowl. "Miss Hastings, please. This is a tactical discussion." "Blackwood Cove," she repeated, stepping out of the shadows and walking back toward the desk. She didn't look at Arthur. She looked at Cavendish. "It is the only inlet on that stretch of the coastline with a natural breakwater that shields it from the southwesterly gales. If they are moving a vessel large enough to carry the stolen silver, and they are doing it in November, they will not risk the open surf of the other coves. Furthermore, the landward approach to Blackwood is an abandoned salt marsh. No customs patrols, no toll roads." Cavendish blinked, looking down at the map. He traced a finger along the jagged coastline. She, she is right, Arthur. Blackwood fits perfectly. Arthur's jaw tightened. Fine. Blackwood Cove. I will lead the dragoons myself. He turned to Higgins. Have my horse saddled, and fetch my heavy cloak. And a carriage, Beatrice added. Arthur stopped. He turned to face her fully, his massive frame radiating an almost physical heat of annoyance. You are returning to your lodgings, Miss Hastings. Your part in this— He paused, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Your concern for your brother is noted, but you will wait here in London. No, she said. The word dropped into the room like a lead weight. Higgins gasped softly. Cavendish looked entirely scandalized. Beatrice met Arthur's pale gray eyes. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands, folded neatly at her waist, were perfectly still. I am going with you, she said, keeping her voice low, reasonable, and entirely devoid of the hysteria they expected from her. Out of the question, Arthur snapped. It will be freezing, muddy, and it will likely end in a firefight. It is no place for a woman. I grew up on that coast, Your Grace, Beatrice countered smoothly, taking half a step closer to the desk. I know the salt marshes. I know the goat paths that lead down to Blackwood Cove. The dragoons will be riding blind in the pitch black. If you take the main road, the smugglers will hear 30 horses a mile away and abort the drop. You need to approach from the north ridge, on foot, through the peat bogs. She paused, letting the silence hang. You need a guide. Arthur stared at her. The air between them felt thick, charged with the unsaid. You stole my answer, her eyes told him. You owe me this. Arthur read it perfectly. He hated it. He hated that she was right. He hated that she knew she was right. And most of all, he hated that he needed her. He looked at the fragile, frayed cuffs of her dark gown, the pale, exhausted exhaustion bruising the skin beneath her eyes, and the terrifying, unbending iron in her spine. Fine, Arthur spat, the word tasting foul in his mouth. Get a heavy cloak, Miss Hastings. If you fall behind, I will leave you in the mud. I assure you, Your Grace, Beatrice murmured, picking up her leather satchel. I am entirely accustomed to picking my own way through the dirt. Part 5. The Agonizing Journey. The carriage ride to the coast was not a triumph. It was an exercise in physical and psychological endurance. Arthur had refused to let her ride on a horseback, citing the storm, though Beatrice suspected he simply didn't want the dragoons to see their duke taking navigational orders from a woman on a gelding. Instead, she was shoved into a dark, violently swaying post-chaise, heavily guarded by outriders. Arthur rode inside with her. Cavendish and Higgins had been left behind to manage the bureaucratic fallout. It was just the two of them in the cramped, freezing box. The rain hadn't stopped. It battered against the roof like a handful of gravel thrown by a giant. The carriage smelled strongly of damp leather, molding velvet, and the heavy metallic scent of wet steel from the brace of pistols Arthur had strapped to his chest. Underneath it all was the sharp, souring scent of his bergamot cologne, now laced with the acrid sweat of a man preparing for violence. Beatrice sat entirely rigid, her spine refusing to touch the back of the seat. Every time the carriage hit a pothole, her knees jarred against Arthur's. He was too large for the space, his broad shoulders encroaching on her side, his long legs taking up the floorboard. Every accidental brush of coarse wool against her skirt made her teeth clench. For the first 2 hours, they didn't speak. Beatrice stared out the window into the pitch black. She was cold to her bones. The borrowed cloak was too large, smelling of stale pipe tobacco, and the draft cut right through the floorboards, turning her damp boots into blocks of ice. Her stomach cramped violently. She realized, with a dull sense of detachment, that she hadn't eaten anything since a piece of stale bread yesterday morning. You set a trap for me. The voice cut through the rhythmic thunder of the hooves and the rain. It was low, dangerous, and lacked the polite, patronizing veneer Arthur had used in the study. Beatrice didn't turn her head. She continued to watch the rain streak across the black glass. I provided a resource, Your Grace. You laid that book out like cheese for a rat, Arthur said, shifting his weight. The carriage groaned in protest. You knew exactly what you were doing. Beatrice finally looked at him. The interior of the carriage was lit only by the occasional flash of a passing inn's lantern, casting his face in harsh, moving shadows. He looked exhausted. He also looked furious. "I gave you the answer to a problem that 30 men of the crown couldn't solve in a month," Beatrice said, her voice raspy from the cold. "How you chose to present that answer to your subordinates is a matter of your own moral elasticity, Your Grace, not mine." Arthur let out a short, harsh breath that was almost a laugh. "Moral elasticity. That's a very polite way of calling me a thief, Miss Hastings." "I am a guest in your carriage," she replied evenly. "Politeness is required." "And if you weren't?" He leaned forward slightly. The proximity was suffocating. He wanted a fight. He wanted her to yell, to weep, to show some crack of acceptable feminine hysteria so he could categorize her, dismiss her, and regain his footing. Beatrice didn't give it to him. She just felt tired. "If I weren't," she said, staring directly into his pale eyes, "I would ask how a man who claims to value logic could be so blindingly arrogant as to ignore a burning fire simply because a woman pointed out the smoke." Arthur flinched. It was a tiny, microscopic tightening of the skin around his eyes, but she saw it. He sat back slowly, the leather seat creaking beneath his weight. "My brother," Beatrice continued, the exhaustion bleeding into her voice, stripping away the polished armor she had worn in London, "has been rotting in Newgate for 3 weeks. He has a cough that rattles his lungs. He is terrified. I did not have the luxury of coddling your pride, Your Grace. I needed the silver found. I needed it done tonight." She turned her face back to the window. Her jaw trembled, just once, betraying the deep, agonizing terror she had been suppressing for weeks. She bit her lip until the pain grounded her. Arthur watched her. For the rest of the agonizing, bone-jarring journey, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the thick, suffocating tension of a cold war. It was the heavy, uncomfortable quiet of a man who had just been handed a mirror and profoundly disliked the reflection. The carriage pitched violently as it left the cobbled turnpike and hit the unpaved, muddy coastal roads. Beatrice was thrown sideways, her shoulder slamming hard into the wooden wall. She hissed in pain, grabbing her collarbone. Arthur's hand shot out instinctively, catching her elbow to steady her. His grip was entirely impersonal, an iron vise meant to prevent her from falling to the floorboards. "We are off the main road," he said, his voice flat, professional. He released her immediately. "How far to the bogs?" Beatrice righted herself, ignoring the throbbing ache in her shoulder. She peered out into the darkness, looking for the silhouette of the jagged ancient oak tree that marked the turnoff. "Half a mile," she said, her voice shaking slightly from the cold. "Tell your outriders to douse the lanterns. From here on, we ride in the dark." Part 6. The cliffside wait. The smell hit her first. It was the scent of her childhood, but stripped of all nostalgia. It was violent and raw. The deep rotting stench of decaying kelp, the sharp sting of salt spray, and the freezing metallic scent of the open ocean in winter. They had left the carriage and the horses a mile inland, hidden within the dense cover of a pine copse. The dragoons, 30 men wrapped in heavy cloaks, moved with terrifying, disciplined silence through the sucking mud of the peat bogs. Beatrice led them, navigating entirely by memory and the faint, ghostly glow of the crashing surf in the distance. Every step was a battle. The mud pulled at her boots, threatening to swallow them whole. Her skirts were heavy with freezing water, clinging to her legs like lead weights, making her thighs burn with the effort of walking. Arthur walked directly behind her. He didn't offer his arm. She wouldn't have taken it if he had, but she was hyper-aware of his presence, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of his boots, the faint, warm mist of his breath hitting the back of her neck when the wind died down for a fraction of a second. They reached the ridge just after 1 a.m. Blackwood Cove lay below them, a crescent of black, churning water flanked by jagged, suicidal rocks. The tide was surging, crashing against the breakwater with a sound like cannon fire, throwing plumes of white spray into the air. It was a terrifying place. It was a perfect place to hide. Arthur signaled his men. They fanned out along the ridge, dropping to their stomachs in the freezing mud, their muskets resting on the slick grass. Down, Arthur murmured, grabbing the heavy fabric of Beatrice's cloak and pulling her toward the ground. She collapsed onto the wet earth. The cold of the ground seeped instantly through her ruined dress, shocking her system. She lay on her stomach beside Arthur, peering over the edge of the cliff down into the black abyss of the cove. They waited. 10 minutes. 20. The rain had turned to a fine, freezing mist that coated everything in a layer of ice. Beatrice was shivering violently. It wasn't a delicate tremble. It was brutal, uncontrollable spasms that wrecked her small frame. Her teeth chattered so hard she thought they might crack. She clamped her jaw shut, shoving her numb hands deep into the pockets of the oversized cloak, curling into a tight, miserable ball. Arthur glanced at her. He could hear the rattling of her breaths. He shifted, unhooking the heavy oilskin layer of his own massive riding coat. Without a word, he dragged the heavy, foul-smelling canvas over her, pinning the edges down to trap the meager heat. It smelled intensely of horse sweat and Arthur's skin. It was heavy, suffocating, and instantly, marginally warmer. Beatrice stiffened, her pride rearing up instinctively, but the cold was too brutal. She didn't push it away. She didn't say thank you. She just burrowed deeper into the mud beneath the canvas. If he is guilty, you know I cannot save him. The words were spoken so quietly, so close to her ear, she almost thought she imagined them over the roar of the surf. She turned her head slightly. Arthur's face was inches from hers, his pale eyes entirely black in the dark. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at her. The ice inside her cracked. It was a messy, painful fracture. "He isn't," she whispered. The rawness of her voice surprised her. It didn't sound cynical. It sounded like a desperate, terrified girl. He is an idiot. He drinks too much. He gambles poorly. He trusts men who wear expensive waistcoats and smile too easily. But he is a coward, Your Grace. He doesn't have the stomach for treason. He was the ledger clerk. They needed a scapegoat." Arthur watched her. The harsh wind whipped a stray lock of wet hair across his forehead. He didn't brush it away. "And you? What are you?" "I am the one who cleans up his messes," she said bitterly. "You're freezing in the mud on a cliff edge waiting for a gang of heavily armed smugglers," Arthur corrected softly. "That is far beyond cleaning up a mess." "Then I am a fool," she snapped, a sudden defensive anger flaring in her chest. She hated the softness in his voice. She hated the pity. She didn't want his understanding. She wanted the silver found. "I am a fool who believed that justice in this country relied on truth, rather than who happened to hold the loudest voice in the room." Arthur's mouth tightened. The brief window of vulnerability slammed shut, replaced by the rigid aristocratic mask. He looked back toward the water. "Look," he said. Beatrice followed his gaze. Out in the black void of the ocean, beyond the breakwater, a tiny singular pinpoint of yellow light flickered. It blinked once, twice, then vanished. A moment later, down on the rocky beach of the cove, a lantern shutter opened, casting a weak beam of light onto the churning surf. They were here. Beatrice stopped, shivering. The sudden spike of adrenaline was a hot, terrifying rush through her veins. She gripped the wet grass, staring down at the beach. From the shadows of the rocks, figures began to emerge. 4, then 8, then 12. They moved with practiced efficiency, dragging heavy, iron-bound crates toward the shoreline, where a longboat was silently cutting through the surf, rowing toward the beach. "Wait," Arthur breathed, his hand raised flat in the air, holding the dragoon steady. The air around them was electric, thick with the anticipation of violence. Let them get the first crate off the boat. Catch them with the silver in their hands. Beatrice couldn't breathe. The roar of the ocean seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy thudding rhythm of her own heart. She watched the smugglers wading into the freezing water, their hands reaching for the ropes of the longboat. Arthur's hand dropped. Now, Part 7. The scent of sulfur and salt. 30 flintlocks sparked in the freezing mist, a jagged, terrifying line of brief yellow fire. The volley tore the night apart. The deafening, concussive crack echoed off the cliffs of the cove, a physical blow to the eardrums that made Beatrice flinch violently, pressing her face entirely into the freezing, wet earth beneath Arthur's oilskin coat. Down on the beach, chaos erupted. The lanterns shattered. Men screamed. The heavy rhythmic crashing of the surf was suddenly undercut by the panicked thrashing of water, the dull thud of lead hitting wood and flesh, and the frantic shouts of the dragoons charging down the treacherous, slick goat paths. Arthur was gone. He had vanished the moment his hand dropped, throwing himself down the ridge with a terrifying, practiced grace, his drawn saber reflecting the erratic flashes of musket fire. Beatrice lay alone on the cliff edge. The cold had ceased to be a sensation and had become a state of being. Her hands were entirely numb, curled into rigid claws near her chest. The smell of the ocean was suddenly violently overpowered by the acrid, choking stench of black powder and sulfur drifting up from the beach. It tasted bitter on her tongue, metallic and foul. She forced her head up, dragging the heavy canvas down just enough to see over the lip of the ridge. It was a slaughter. Or a rout. It was impossible to tell in the erratic, shifting shadows. The dragoons were highly trained men of the crown. The smugglers were desperate men cornered against a freezing, violent ocean. Beatrice saw the flash of bayonets in the gloom, heard the sickening, wet crunch of a rifle butt striking a skull. A horse neighed somewhere in the distance, one of the smugglers' pack animals, terrified by the gunfire. She watched a man, soaked and bleeding, try to drag himself back into the freezing surf, only to be dragged out by the collar by two dragoons. The crates, 4 massive iron-bound boxes, sat half-submerged in the foam, heavy with the Admiralty's silver. It was over in less than 10 minutes. The gunfire sputtered and died, replaced by the groans of the injured, the sharp, barking orders of the sergeants, and the relentless, indifferent roar of the tide. Beatrice let her head drop back into the mud. She squeezed her eyes shut. She had done it. Thomas was safe. The silver was found. Arthur had his prize. Suddenly, a sound cut through the noise below. A frantic, scraping, scrabbling noise. It wasn't coming from the beach. It was coming from the cliff face directly beneath her. Someone had bolted. A smuggler, realizing the beach was lost, was hauling himself up the sheer, jagged rocks of the ridge, desperate to reach the salt marshes before the dragoons secured the perimeter. The scraping grew louder. Frantic, ragged breathing punctuated the sound of crumbling rock and snapping roots. Beatrice's eyes snapped open. The adrenaline, which had been ebbing away into exhausted relief, flooded back into her system like a shot of pure, burning venom. She couldn't feel her fingers. She couldn't stand. Her skirts were frozen into a heavy, immovable shell of ice and mud. A hand, thick with dirt and scraped bloody, slammed over the edge of the cliff, tearing into the grass mere feet from her head. Beatrice shoved backward, kicking frantically with boots she couldn't feel. She scrambled out from under the oilskin coat, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. A head appeared over the ridge. He was a massive man, his face obscured by a woolen cap in the dark, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He saw the coat first, then he saw her. A woman, alone, covered in mud. He didn't hesitate. He hauled himself over the edge with a guttural grunt, drawing a short, thick blade from his belt. He needed a hostage. He needed a way out. Beatrice tried to scream, but her throat was paralyzed by the cold. She scrambled onto her knees, her hands slipping uselessly in the slick, wet peat. She was going to die here. She had solved the greatest puzzle of the crown, saved her idiotic brother, and she was going to have her throat cut in the mud by a desperate man. The man lunged. A shadow separated itself from the darkness behind him. Arthur slammed into the man with the force of a falling anvil. There was no shout, no warning, just the brutal, terrifying sound of 2 massive bodies colliding. They hit the ground hard, rolling toward the edge of the cliff. Beatrice threw her hands over her ears, crawling backward, her heart hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. The struggle was violent, silent, and desperately short. Arthur didn't fight like a gentleman. He didn't duel. He fought like a man who understood that survival required absolute, ruthless efficiency. There was a sickening snap of bone. The smuggler went entirely limp, crying out a wet, gargling gasp before slumping into the mud. Arthur rose slowly. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked through with rain, mud, and the dark, unmistakable stain of fresh blood. He kicked the smuggler's blade over the edge of the cliff, watching it disappear into the dark water below. He turned to Beatrice. He looked terrifying. The pale aristocrat in the mahogany study was gone. This man was feral, stripped of his titles and his arrogance, reduced to muscle, instinct, and violence. The blood on his shirt was spreading. Beatrice remained on her knees, shaking uncontrollably. She stared at him, her chest heaving, the metallic taste of fear burning her throat. Arthur didn't say a word. He walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching in the wet grass. He stooped down, picked up his discarded mud-soaked oilskin coat, and wrapped it securely around her shivering shoulders. He pulled the collar tight under her chin, his large, calloused hands brushing against the freezing skin of her throat. His fingers were trembling. Beatrice looked up into his face. He wasn't looking at her with pity, or annoyance, or aristocratic disdain. He was looking at her with a profound, terrifying realization. "The silver is secured," he said, his voice a harsh, ragged rasp. Beatrice swallowed the lump in her throat. She nodded once, a jerky, uneven movement. "Good," she whispered. Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy second, his chest still heaving. Then he reached down, gripped her by the waist of her frozen dress, and hauled her effortlessly to her feet. "We are going inland," he ordered, his hand firmly gripping her elbow, "before you freeze to death and ruin my victory." Part 8. The Thaw. The village of Oakhaven consisted of 7 dilapidated cottages, a rotting pier, and a tavern called the Blind Boar. By 3 a.m, the tavern had been commandeered by the British Army. The landlord, a terrified, sweating man missing 3 teeth, huddled in the corner while dragoons barricaded the surviving 12 smugglers in the cellar. The 4 iron-bound crates of Admiralty silver sat heavily in the center of the taproom, dripping seawater and sand onto the warped floorboards. The smell inside was a thick, suffocating mixture of cheap fermented ale, stale pipe tobacco, wet wool, and the coppery tang of unwashed, bleeding men. To Beatrice, it smelled like heaven. She sat in a splintering wooden chair positioned directly in front of the massive stone hearth. The fire was roaring, spitting sap and smoke into the room. The physical pain of thawing out was agonizing. As the heat penetrated her frozen clothes, the blood began to rush back into her extremities. It felt as though her hands and feet were being pierced by thousands of red-hot needles. She bit down hard on her lower lip, refusing to make a sound, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clamped tightly under her armpits. The tavern was loud with the chaotic aftermath of the raid, but Beatrice was locked in her own private world of agonizing, physical recovery. A heavy, wooden chair scraped against the floorboards beside her. She opened her eyes. Arthur slumped heavily into the seat next to her. He had shed his ruined coat. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his cravat gone. A dragoon medic had hastily bandaged his left shoulder where the smuggler's blade had caught him. The white linen was already blooming with a faint pink stain. He looked at the fire, his pale eyes bloodshot, shadows carving deep, exhausted canyons into his face. In his right hand, he held 2 battered tin cups. He held one out to her. "Drink," he commanded softly. Beatrice uncurled one numb hand. Her fingers shook so violently she could barely grasp the metal rim. Arthur didn't let go immediately. He supported the weight of the cup until she had a secure hold. His hand was warm. It felt like a brand against her freezing skin. She brought the cup to her lips. It was gin. It was cheap, poorly distilled, and burned like turpentine as it went down her throat. She coughed violently, her chest aching, but the liquid lit a desperate, necessary fire in her stomach. Arthur downed his in a single, fluid motion, barely wincing. He set the cup on the hearthstones. They sat in silence. The fire crackled. Behind them, a sergeant barked orders about the prisoner manifest. It felt as though they were separated from the rest of the room by an invisible, impenetrable wall. You didn't scream. Arthur spoke without looking at her. He was watching the flames, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. Beatrice stared into the cup of gin. The fumes made her eyes water. "Screaming takes air, Your Grace. I was entirely out of it." He was twice your size. He had a knife. Arthur turned his head. His gaze was heavy, pinning her to the chair. "I've seen seasoned soldiers wet themselves in terror over less. You just scrambled backward. You tried to buy time. I wanted to live," she said simply. Her voice was flat, devoid of heroics. It wasn't bravery, it was biology. "Stop doing that." Beatrice frowned, looking at him. "Doing what?" "Diminishing yourself," Arthur snapped, a sudden jagged edge of anger cutting through his exhaustion. He leaned toward her, the heat of his body radiating into her side. "Stop acting as though your intellect and your survival are mere accidents of nature. It's insulting." Beatrice's jaw tightened. The exhaustion and the gin stripped away the polite, submissive veneer she had carefully maintained since arriving at his estate. "I diminish myself, Your Grace, because it is the only way men like you will tolerate my presence," she fired back, her voice low but vibrating with years of suppressed fury. "If I had walked into your study and demanded you listen to me, you would have had me thrown out. You know it. I had to plant a book on a table and let you believe you discovered the answer. I had to orchestrate your own brilliance so you wouldn't feel threatened by mine." Arthur flinched. He didn't look away, but his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched violently under his skin. "And out there on the cliff," she continued, her breathing shallow, "if I had panicked, if I had become the hysterical woman society expects me to be, you would have felt vindicated. You would have said, 'I told you so.' You would have had an excuse to dismiss me again." She took a shaky breath, the firelight catching the angry tears shining in her eyes, tears she refused to let fall. "So do not lecture me about diminishing myself, Duke. I shrink so that I can survive in rooms built for you." The silence between them was deafening. Even the background noise of the tavern seemed to fade away. Arthur looked at her. He looked at her tangled, wet hair plastered to her forehead, the dark bruises of exhaustion under her eyes, the mud drying on her pale cheeks, and the absolute, unbending iron in her stare. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur reached out. He didn't grab her arm or pat her shoulder. He simply laid his large, warm palm gently over her freezing, ink-stained hand resting on her lap. His thumb brushed lightly against the blue ink smeared across her index finger. "You terrified me tonight, Beatrice," he said. His voice was a bare whisper, rough and ragged. He didn't use her surname. "Not because I thought you would fail, because I realized with absolute certainty that you were the smartest person I have ever met, and that I had treated you like a child." Beatrice stopped breathing. Her heart gave a violent, painful lurch against her ribs. She looked down at his hand covering hers. It was an intimate, shocking gesture, entirely out of place in a room full of soldiers and smugglers. "I'm sorry," Arthur said. It wasn't a rehearsed apology. It felt ripped from his throat, painful and raw. He was a man who had never had to apologize to a woman who wasn't his mother or his sovereign. Beatrice looked back up at his face. The arrogance was gone. The aristocratic armor was cracked wide open. He was just a man, exhausted, bleeding, and entirely humbled. She slowly turned her hand over, intertwining her freezing fingers with his warm ones. She gripped his hand tightly. "The silver is found," she whispered. "That is what matters." "No," Arthur said, his gray eyes dark in the firelight. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, sending a shiver up her arm that had nothing to do with the cold. "That is not all that matters." Part 9. The Reckoning in London. Newgate Prison smelled of despair, unwashed bodies, and the sharp ammonia sting of fear. It was a suffocating subterranean stench that clung to the clothes and coated the back of the throat. Beatrice stood in the master's side ward, an area reserved for prisoners who could afford to bribe the turnkeys for a shred of basic dignity. It was still a lightless, wretched stone box. 3 days had passed since the ambush at the cove. The dragoons had returned in triumph. The Duke of Westford was celebrated in the morning papers as a strategic genius. The missing silver was back in the Admiralty's vaults, and Thomas Hastings was finally free. He stood before her, clutching a small canvas bag of his belongings. He was pale, thinner than she remembered, his eyes darting nervously around the stone walls. A wet, rattling cough tore from his chest, making his thin frame shake. "It's a bloody miracle, Bee," Thomas rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. He smiled, a weak, arrogant curve of his lips that made Beatrice's stomach twist. "I told you the Duke would sort it. I told you Pendleton wasn't a fool. Once he looked at my ledgers, he obviously saw the discrepancy. Good man, Arthur. Always knew he was a sharp one." Beatrice stared at her brother. She had ridden for 2 days in the freezing rain. She had stood on a cliff edge while men bled to death in the mud. She had been hunted by a man with a knife. She had swallowed her pride, her anger, and her dignity, all to save the man standing in front of her. And he didn't know. He would never know. His fragile, masculine ego couldn't handle the truth that his spinster sister had deciphered a code the Admiralty couldn't break and manipulated a duke into executing the raid. Beatrice felt a profound, exhausting emptiness wash over her. She loved her brother, but in that moment she saw him clearly. He was a weak man, entirely dependent on the grace and labor of the women he ignored. "Yes, Thomas," Beatrice said softly, her voice hollow. "The Duke sorted it. Come along. The carriage is waiting." She turned and walked toward the heavy iron gate. As she stepped out of the ward, she froze. Arthur Pendleton stood in the dim corridor. He wore a dark charcoal coat, his cravat tied perfectly, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked like royalty descending into hell. The turnkeys cowered at the end of the hall, terrified by his mere presence. He wasn't looking at Thomas. He was looking entirely at Beatrice. He had heard every word. Thomas stopped behind her, letting out a sharp gasp. "Your Grace, I cannot thank you enough. Your brilliance in this matter." "Be silent, Hastings!" Arthur snapped, his voice a low, dangerous whip crack that echoed off the stone walls. He didn't even glance at Thomas. His pale eyes remained locked on Beatrice. Thomas snapped his mouth shut, shrinking back slightly. Arthur stepped forward. The heavy scent of bergamot cut through the stench of the prison. He stopped inches from Beatrice. The memory of his warm, blood-stained hand covering hers in the tavern hung in the space between them, electric and unspoken. "Your carriage is waiting outside," Arthur said to Thomas, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Go. My men will see you return to your estate in Kent. Do not return to London. You do not have the constitution or the intellect for this city." Thomas flushed a dark, angry red, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Duke suffocated any protest. He scurried past them, clutching his bag, desperate to escape the prison walls. Beatrice watched him go. She felt a strange, detached sense of finality. She had done her duty. She was done. She turned to follow her brother. Arthur stepped into her path, blocking the corridor entirely. "Move, Your Grace," Beatrice said quietly. The exhaustion was back, a heavy weight in her bones. "No, my brother's waiting." "Your brother is a fool who will bankrupt your estate again within a year," Arthur said bluntly, "and you will spend the rest of your life exhausting your brilliant mind trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship." Beatrice looked up at him. The dim light of the prison lantern cast sharp, angular shadows across his face. "That is my burden. It doesn't have to be." Arthur took a half step closer. The space between them evaporated. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could see the pulse beating steadily at the base of his throat. "I submitted the final report to the Admiralty this morning," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. Beatrice stiffened. "I trust you enjoyed your accolades." "I told them the truth." Beatrice stopped breathing. She stared at him, her eyes widening. "You did what?" "I told them I was staring at a wall for 3 weeks," Arthur said, his eyes intensely focused on hers, stripping away every defense she had left. I told them that a woman from Kent walked into my study, pointed out the tide charts, and deduced the location of the drop within 20 minutes. "But they will laugh at you," Beatrice breathed, horrified. "They will say you are covering for a subordinate. They will mock your pride." "Let them mock," Arthur said fiercely. He reached out, his hands grasping her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding, entirely desperate. "I do not care about the Admiralty. I do not care about the drawing rooms. I care about the fact that I have spent my entire life surrounded by men who agree with me, and I was bored to death until you walked into my study and made me feel entirely, completely stupid." Beatrice's mouth parted slightly. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't a confession of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of absolute, terrifying respect. "What do you want from me, Arthur?" she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. His eyes darkened. He moved his hands from her shoulders, sliding them slowly up the slender column of her neck, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, sending a shudder ripping through her spine. "I want you to stop hiding," he said, his voice a rough velvet command. "I want you to let your brother rot in the country. Stay in London. I have an estate with a library that requires a mind like yours. I have political enemies who require a strategist I can actually trust. I have a life that suddenly feels entirely hollow without you pointing out my flaws." He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. The scent of bergamot and starched linen surrounded her. "Work with me, Beatrice," he breathed against her lips. "Argue with me, outsmart me. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to keep up with you." Beatrice closed her eyes. The urge to yield, to sink into the overwhelming, intoxicating force of his presence was powerful. But she was not a woman who surrendered easily. She opened her eyes, meeting his intense gray gaze. She didn't pull away, but she didn't soften. "If I stay," she whispered, her breath mixing with his, "I will not be a silent partner, Your Grace. I will not sit in the shadows and let you claim the light." A slow, devastatingly beautiful smile broke across Arthur's face, entirely transforming his severe features. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "I am counting on it," he murmured. He didn't wait for her permission. He closed the remaining distance, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was raw, hungry, and desperate, fueled by the adrenaline of the past 3 days, the lingering taste of fear, and the explosive release of weeks of suffocating tension. Beatrice gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his coat, anchoring herself to him as the world tilted violently on its axis. He kissed her like a man who had been starving and had just realized it. He tasted of tea, expensive scotch, and the dark, intoxicating thrill of an equal match. Beatrice kissed him back with all the suppressed fury and passion she had buried for years, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer in the dark, wretched hallway of the prison. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other in the dim light. Beatrice looked at the Duke of Westford. He was arrogant, he was infuriating, and he was the only man who had ever truly seen her. She slowly released his lapels, smoothing the wrinkled wool with a trembling hand. "Your carriage is waiting, Arthur," she said, her voice husky, a small, cynical smile playing on her lips. "We have a great deal of work to do." Arthur laughed, a deep, resonant sound that chased the shadows from the stone walls. He offered her his arm. "Lead the way, Miss Hastings." If you felt the spark of that long-overdue vindication, if you cheered when Beatrice finally stepped out of the shadows and let the Duke choke on his own pride and his own desire, hit that like button. We all know the quietest, most brilliant person in the room rarely gets the credit, but sometimes forcing a man to admit his own ignorance is the most romantic thing he can do. Subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, messy, and unapologetic historical dramas where the women do the rescuing. Share this with anyone who refuses to shrink to fit a room. Drop a comment. Did Arthur redeem himself, or should she have left him in the mud? See you in the next story.